They called her too opinionated, too sharp-tongued, not wife material. She read that note 3 times, and every single time, she stood up a little straighter. Most people would have crumbled. Clara Whitfield got mad. And mad, it turns out, was exactly what she needed to survive what came next. Welcome to a channel built for hearts that love the wide-open West. Stories of real love, of mothers who fight like mountains, of strangers who become family, and of kindness that costs something. Sometimes the door that slams in your face is pointing you straight toward the one that was always meant to open. If Clara's story already has you feeling something, leave a comment, share this with a friend, like the video and subscribe, because there are many more stories just like this one, waiting for you.
Now, where were we? The letter, the one that broke her world apart, was handed to her by the old station master, not the man who wrote it. That's the part Clara would never forget. Douglas Pratt saw her get off that train. He watched her face, the way she stood, the way she lifted her chin to look around that strange place. And then he simply turned his back on her. He scribbled his verdict on that paper, gave it to old Guthrie behind the counter, and walked away without so much as a howdy. Too opinionated, it read, too sharp-tongued for a proper wife. I have arranged your return trip on tomorrow's train. I wish you well. Clara read it once, then again. Her hands were shaking something fierce, but she clenched her jaw and made herself read it a 3rd time. She needed the anger to burn hotter than the hurt. Anger was a tool. The tears could come later, when she was alone and no one was watching. It happens, Guthrie mumbled from his little office. He was a stooped-over fellow with yellow fingers from his tobacco and the kind of tired eyes that had seen it all before. Tickets all paid for. Train leaves at 8 in the morning. Clara folded the note with sharp, deliberate creases. How could he possibly know I'm too opinionated? We never even spoke. Guthrie just shrugged his shoulders. Reckon he saw all he needed to through the window. He saw a tired woman in a wrinkled dress. That is all he saw. Guthrie didn't have an answer for that. He just shuffled back inside his office, and Clara heard the little window slide shut with a click. She was all by herself on that platform with her trunk, her $12, and the cold, sinking feeling that there was no place left for her in the world. She couldn't go forward. Douglas Pratt had slammed that door shut. And she sure couldn't go back. Her own family had made that plain as day. She could still hear her mother's voice on the morning she left Philadelphia. Don't you come back, Clara. There is nothing for you here. This is the chance you've got. You take it, and you don't look back. Her mother hadn't said it to be mean, but there wasn't any softness in it either. It was the sound of a woman who knew exactly how many mouths she had to feed, and how little money there was to do it. With Clara gone, there was one less plate on the table. It meant her little brother, Thomas, could get his medicine. Clara had agreed to marry a man she'd never met because the numbers said she had to. Not for love, and not for adventure. She did it because her family was sinking, and she was the one they could afford to lose. And now the man who was supposed to save her had cast her off like a worn-out shoe. She bit her lip so hard she could taste copper. She would not cry. That was a promise she'd made to herself somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, just watching the flat land roll on forever. No matter what happens, you will not let them see you cry. She'd kept that promise through 3 long days of bad food and trying to sleep sitting up on a hard wooden bench, all while a knot of fear grew tighter in her stomach. She was going to keep it now. You waiting for somebody, ma'am? The voice that spoke behind her was low and steady. It was the kind of voice that came from a man who didn't talk just to hear himself talk. Clara turned around and had to look up to see a tall man dressed in dusty ranch clothes. He wore a leather vest, a shirt faded by the sun, and boots that looked like they'd seen their share of hard miles. The brim of his hat shadowed most of his face, but she could make out a strong jawline and eyes the color of a pale blue sky, almost silver in the afternoon sun. Those eyes weren't filled with pity or even much curiosity. They just watched her with a calm, patient look, like he had all the time in the world for her to answer. No, Clara said, and her voice was a lot stronger than she felt. "It seems I've been left." The man looked her over for a second. It wasn't like Pratt sizing her up and finding something wrong. It was more like he was reading a map, trying to understand the terrain before he spoke. "Are you the mail-order bride for Douglas Pratt?" he asked. A hot wave of shame washed over Clara's face. She wanted to lie, to say she was just passing through, to be anyone but a woman who'd been ordered and returned like faulty merchandise. But she was too tired to lie. "I was," she said, and the words felt like grit in her mouth. "Mr. Pratt decided I was not suitable. Apparently I asked why I was left waiting for 3 hours, and that showed a bad character." Something flickered in the man's expression. It wasn't quite a smile, just a little twitch at the corner of his mouth. "You asked him why you were waiting?" "I asked the station master, and I admit I wasn't quiet about it. Mr. Pratt must have been hiding somewhere, listening in. And that was all it took for him to send you away? That was enough for him to decide I had a tongue that was too sharp." Clara held out the crumpled letter, showing him the man's own handwriting. The stranger was quiet for a long moment. Then he just said it, plain and simple. "Pratt's a fool." Clara blinked. She figured she'd get sympathy, or maybe he'd just get awkward and walk away like Guthrie had. She never expected a complete stranger to pass judgment on Douglas Pratt, like he was just commenting on a cloudy sky. "Well, I appreciate you saying so," she finally said. "It's not an opinion, ma'am. It's a fact." His eyes moved from her trunk back to her face. You could almost see the wheels turning in his head, weighing something out. "My name is Ethan Calloway. I own the Redstone Ranch, about 6 miles north of here. I've got a wagon just outside." He paused for a heartbeat, a pause that felt like he was giving himself one last chance to back out of whatever he was about to say. "I can give you a ride to the boarding house. Let you get your bearings." Clara looked at him then, really looked at him. He stood there, perfectly balanced, his hands relaxed by his sides. He wasn't trying to be intimidating, and he wasn't overly friendly. He was just making an offer. And after 3 days of being shipped like a parcel to a man who didn't want her, the simple kindness of being offered a choice felt like a miracle. "I would," she started to say, but the depot door swung open with a bang. Guthrie poked his head out again. "That eastbound train leaves at 8 tomorrow morning, Miss Whitfield. Mr. Pratt already paid for your ticket, so you best be on it. The train won't wait for you." Every word felt like a slap in the face. Mr. Pratt already paid. As if her whole life, her whole 2,000-mile journey was nothing more than a transaction that could be canceled and refunded. Something inside Clara didn't break. It hardened. Like wet clay baked in a fire, it became solid and strong. She turned to Guthrie. "You can tell Mr. Pratt that I'm mighty grateful for his concern over other people's lives." The old man's eyebrows went up, but he didn't say a word, just disappeared back inside his office. Ethan Calloway was watching her, and the look on his face was hard to figure. It wasn't exactly admiration, but it was close. It was a look of understanding, like he knew what it was to be backed into a corner and still refused to bend. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," Clara said, turning back to him. "I would be very grateful for a ride to the boarding house." He just gave her a short nod. Then he bent down, grabbed her heavy trunk with one hand, and lifted it to his shoulder like it was filled with nothing but straw. Started walking toward the front of the depot, and Clara moved to walk with him. But then he stopped cold. He just stopped, right in the middle of a step. His shoulders squared up as he turned back to look at old Guthrie, who was staring at them through the ticket window, not even trying to hide his nosiness. "John," Ethan said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air, clear and sure. The kind of voice that carries over a wide-open prairie. "If anyone comes around asking for her, you can tell them my wife is staying with me at the Redstone from now on." The air left Clara's lungs in a rush. "I beg your pardon?" Ethan turned and looked her right in the eye. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He didn't look like a man who had just said the craziest thing in the world. He looked like a man who had done the math and come up with the only answer that added up. Just giving you another option, Miss Whitfield, he said, his voice low. You can get on that train tomorrow morning, or you can think about a different kind of arrangement. Clara's head was spinning, her heart was pounding in her ears. She hadn't even been in this town for an hour. One man had already thrown her away, and now another one was claiming her as his wife. It was so ridiculous she should have laughed. But she didn't feel like laughing. She felt a hot surge of anger. You do not even know me, she said. Her voice was low and sharp. We have said fewer than 20 sentences to each other, and you are telling the station master that I am your wife. I know you traveled 2,000 miles on pure faith, Ethan answered. I know a man turned you away without even having the decency to look you in the eye. And I know you are standing here with your head held high instead of breaking down, which says more about you than 20 sentences ever could. Clara opened her mouth to object, but found she had no words. It was not because he was mistaken, but because no one had ever laid out her situation with such stark truth. Ethan lowered his voice even more. I am in need of a housekeeper. You are in need of a place to live. We can talk about the details on the way. Nobody else has to know what our arrangement is. From inside the station, Guthrie's voice called out, Are you taking her as your wife, Calloway? Ethan's gaze never left Clara's. If she will have me. The solid ground seemed to sway under Clara's feet. It felt like she was standing at a crossroads she did not know was there 5 minutes earlier. Both roads ahead seemed to lead into the unknown. One took her back to Philadelphia, to her mother's weary relief, her father's quiet disappointment, and her brother's medicine they still could not pay for. The other road led to a ranch she had never laid eyes on, with a man she had known for a total of about 7 minutes. What exactly would this arrangement be, she heard herself ask. Ethan placed the trunk on the platform. He stood up straight and faced her directly. For the first time, she saw that his hands were rough and scarred. They were the hands of a man who built things, who repaired things, who worked until the job was finished. Meals on the table, clothes mended, and the house looked after. His voice was even and matter-of-fact, like he was outlining a business deal. In return, you get a roof over your head, food to eat, and my protection. He stopped for a moment, and when he spoke next, his tone changed. It became lower, softer, and held something Clara would spend weeks trying to identify before she realized it was respect. As for anything beyond that, he said, that would be your decision entirely. I am not a man who forces his will on anyone. Clara felt the anger inside her fade away, replaced by a feeling that was much more complex. This man was nothing like Douglas Pratt. Mr. Pratt had advertised for a wife like a man looking for a good horse, making a list of qualities he wanted, expecting complete obedience, and then rejecting the delivery when it did not pass his inspection. Ethan Calloway was standing before her, proposing a fair trade between two equals. The idea was still completely wild. She understood that. But it was an honest kind of wildness. And after 3 days of polite deceptions and a cowardly letter, that honesty felt like the most solid thing in the world. And what if I want to leave? She asked. In that case, I will drive you to the station myself. A small, lopsided smile touched his lips. It was the first genuine expression she had seen on his guarded face. Though I would hope you would give the Redstone a fair shot before you go. Clara studied him for a long moment. She thought about her family. She thought about the letter from Douglas Pratt. She thought about the train heading east, the $12 in her purse, and the life of low wages and quiet shame that awaited her in Philadelphia. Then she looked up at the sky over this strange town. She had never seen a sky so vast. It seemed to lay over the land like a comforting hand, heavy but somehow healing. All right, Mr. Calloway, she said. Her voice was steady, even if her heart was racing. I accept your job offer. As for the other business, I think we should act properly before we make any announcements. The lopsided smile grew a little wider, just enough to change his expression from cautious to nearly friendly. Reckon so. He hefted her trunk once more and looked at Guthrie. "You had best let folks know that Miss Woodfield has found a place to land. We would not want Pratt getting any ideas about changing his mind." Guthrie gave a slow nod, his eyes flicking between Ethan and Clara, sizing up the situation like a man who had seen this town's little dramas unfold for a lifetime. "You got it, Calloway. I will spread the word that your wife arrived in one piece." Clara winced at the word wife, but she held her tongue. There would be a time for sorting out the proper terms later. All that mattered now was getting off this train platform before she broke down completely. Ethan guided her around the station house to a sturdy buckboard hitched to a pair of bay horses. The animals turned their heads to watch her approach, and one let out a soft huff of air through its nose, making its own judgment. Ethan placed the trunk in the wagon bed, then turned to her. He held his hand out, palm facing up, an open invitation, not a demand, leaving the choice entirely to her. Clara took it. His grip was strong but gentle, the hold of a man who knew that real strength did not need to be rough. He helped her up to the high seat, and she smoothed her skirts while he walked around to the driver's side. "You still have an opportunity to reconsider," he said in a low voice as he settled in beside her. "That train heads back east tomorrow." Clara gazed out at the town of Silver Bluff. It was a rough little place, caked in dust and filled with unfamiliar faces. The buildings were squat and plain. The main street was nothing but dirt. It was a world away from the life she had left behind. But Douglas Pratt had rejected her from the comfort of an office window, while Ethan Calloway had looked her straight in the eye and recognized her courage without needing to say the word. "No," she said. "I journeyed west to make a new life for myself. I plan to do precisely that." Ethan clucked to the horses. The wagon lurched and began to roll. They traveled the first mile without a word between them. Clara felt every bump and rut in the road, heard the groan of the wagon's wood, and sensed the vast, empty land closing in around her. She held onto the seat with both hands and fought the thought that she was riding into the wilderness with a man she just met, who had just announced to the whole town that she was his wife. "You must have questions," Ethan said. It was a statement of fact. "I have about 100 of them. Why not start with the most important ones?" Clara thought for a moment. "Why? Why did you help me? You could have hired a housekeeper from town. You could have sent away for your own mail-order bride if you truly wanted one. Why make this offer to a woman you saw stranded at a train station?" Ethan was silent for a good while. The sound of the horses' hooves was a steady beat on the hard-packed ground. "A couple of reasons," he said at last. "First, Pratt and his partner Hargrove have been trying to run me off my land for 2 years. They are after the water rights on my place. A wife makes a man look more settled and harder to push around. A lone man on a ranch can look like an easy target. A family man with a home looks like he is here to stay. So I am a business strategy," Clara said. Ethan winced at her choice of words. "That is the practical part, but there is another reason." He gave her a quick, direct look before focusing back on the road. "I saw you when you read that letter. You read it through 3 times. I was watching from the other side of the platform, and every time you finished, you stood up just a little bit taller. Most folks, when they get news like that, they just fall apart. You did not. You got mad. You think it is good to be angry? I think it is good when someone can take their hurt and turn it into something useful instead of letting it break them." He paused. "The Redstone needs that kind of strength. I have been managing it by myself for too long." Clara did not answer immediately. She let his words hang in the air between them, trying to judge if he was being truthful. She had spent all of her adult years listening for the lies in men's words, catching the false tones, the well-rehearsed sincerity, and the promises that vanished at the first hint of trouble. It was a skill she had learned because she had to. She could not find any hint of a lie in Ethan Calloway's voice. "Tell me about Douglas Pratt," she said then. Ethan's jaw became tight. "What is it you want to know?" "Everything. If I am going to be living 6 miles away from the man who brought me all this way just to reject me, I want to know exactly who I am up against." Ethan nodded slowly with a look of approval, as if she had just passed a test he had not mentioned. Pratt showed up in Silver Bluff about 4 years ago, with a lot of money that no one could explain. He started buying land. He loaned money to other ranchers when the drought hit. When they could not pay him back, he took their land. He now owns 3 ranches that used to belong to good, hard-working families. And your ranch? Mine is the one he cannot touch. I never took a loan from him. I have never owed him a single cent. But my land is on Elk Creek, which is the best water in this whole valley. Pratt has to have it for the big cattle operation he's trying to build. He has been trying to get me to sell for 2 years. And you refuse. I built the Redstone from the ground up. I worked for 10 years as a ranch hand, saved up every last dollar, and bought this place fair and square from the Garrett family after the influenza took their menfolk and they could not run it anymore. I did not come all this way just to let a man like Pratt take it from me. Clara heard the resolve in his voice and understood something new about Ethan Calloway. He was more than just a rancher. He was a man fighting for something he had earned with his own sweat and sorrow. And he would fight for it with everything he had. She knew that feeling very well. She had it in her, too. "You mentioned Pratt has a partner," Clara said. "Hargrove. Franklin Hargrove is the one who runs the bank in town. He is sharper than Pratt, which makes him more dangerous. Pratt makes open threats. Hargrove uses paperwork, contracts, property liens, and foreclosure papers. Between the two of them, they have a tight grip on half this valley. And having a wife is protection from all this? How? A married man with a home is seen as a permanent part of the community. A single man is seen as a temporary target. Hargrove has been spreading rumors that the Redstone is a failing ranch. Just one man, no family, no real future. If I have a wife, that story does not hold up anymore." Clara took all of this in. She was being asked to be a protective shield just as much as a housekeeper. A clear sign of permanence in a fight she was just starting to comprehend. "You should have told me about that at the depot," she said. "Would it have altered your decision?" Clara thought about his question. "No," she admitted, "but I do not like getting the truth in small pieces. If we are to have an arrangement, I require you to be straight with me, completely straight about all of it." Ethan nodded. "That is fair, and I will be." They rode onward. The land spread out around them, a vast expanse of rolling hills dotted with cattle and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees. In the distance, the mountains were turning a soft pink as the sun began to set. "One more question," Clara said. "Go right ahead. What happened to your previous housekeeper?" Ethan's expression did not change, but she saw something tighten in his eyes. "I never had one. Miguel and I get by poorly, but we manage. Miguel Reyes helps me run the ranch. He's a good man and knows more about cattle and growing things than anyone in this territory. He stays in the bunkhouse, and he will be fine with this arrangement." Ethan glanced over at her. "Miguel has been telling me for 2 years that I need to stop living like a hermit and find someone to help with the work. He will be relieved." Clara almost allowed herself a smile. "Almost. Then I have one condition, Mr. Calloway. Name it. I am not a decoration, and I am not a prop. If I am going to live on your ranch and help you maintain it, I want to understand the entire operation. The cattle, the finances, the water rights, every last detail. I did not travel 2,000 miles to be kept in the dark about things." Ethan turned fully to look at her. The fading light highlighted his face, and for the first time she saw something more than his usual quiet reserve. It was surprise, yes, but she also saw a look that was close to admiration. "Most women would not ask about that," he said. "Most women were not rejected by Douglas Pratt for having too many opinions." Clara met his stare. "I intend to make that very quality a strength instead of a weakness." The corner of Ethan's mouth twitched upward. It was the nearest thing to a true smile she had seen from him yet. "You have got yourself a deal, Miss Whitfield." Clara, she corrected him. If you are telling people I am your wife, you should at least call me by my first name. Clara, then, he said the word carefully, as if testing its flavor. Then it is Ethan, since we are being honest. The wagon topped a low ridge, and the Redstone Ranch unfolded below them. Clara saw a house, a barn, a corral, and outbuildings, all of them looking solid and real, all of them waiting. Her stomach twisted with a knot of fear and something else that she refused to acknowledge. Ethan pulled the team to a stop at the crest of the hill. He did not say a word. He just allowed her a moment to look. "It is certainly not Philadelphia," Clara said after a long silence. "No," Ethan agreed. "It is not." Clara took in a deep breath and then another one. Then she straightened her back. It was the same gesture she had made on the depot platform, the one that Ethan had noticed and remembered. "Take me home, Ethan," she said. It was the first time she had called any place home since she had left Philadelphia. She felt the significance of the word and chose to accept it. Ethan clicked to the horses, and the wagon started down the slope toward the ranch. Behind them, the final rays of sunlight blazed across the Wyoming sky like a promise, or perhaps a warning. Clara was not sure which it was, but she was finished with waiting for other people to determine her future. Whatever came next, she would meet it standing on her own 2 feet. The wagon had barely come to a stop before a man stepped out from the barn holding a rifle. Clara's fingers dug into the seat. Ethan did not even flinch. He raised one hand, palm open, and called out, "It is me, Miguel. You can put that down now." Miguel Reyes lowered the rifle but did not put it away completely. He was a wiry man, around 50, with graying hair and the type of eyes that had seen enough to no longer be surprised by anything. He looked at Ethan. Then his eyes moved to Clara. Then he looked back at Ethan with an expression that communicated everything that would have taken too long to say out loud. "Who is this?" Miguel asked. "This is Clara Whitfield. She will be staying here at the Redstone." Miguel's eyebrows went up about half an inch. "Staying for how long?" "That depends on her." Ethan climbed down from the wagon and walked around to Clara's side. He offered his hand again, the same open palm, the same unhurried patience. Clara took it and stepped down, feeling the solid, packed earth under her boots like it was a final verdict. Miguel studied her the way a man inspects a horse he has been asked to rely on, searching for any sign of panic or weakness. Clara met his gaze directly and extended her hand. "Mr. Reyes, I appreciate you not shooting us." Miguel blinked. He looked at her hand, then to her face, and a slight change came over his expression. He shook her hand with a grip that was firm and quick. "You are the bride Pratt sent for?" "The one he sent back," Clara corrected. "There is a difference." Miguel looked at Ethan. A long, meaningful glance passed between the two men. It was the kind of silent conversation that only comes from years of working side by side through difficult seasons. "I will put the horses up," Miguel said at last. He took the reins from Ethan and led the team toward the barn. Over his shoulder, he added, "The kitchen is a mess, just so you know." He was not wrong. The inside of the house was a testament to neglect. Dishes were stacked high in the basin, unwashed. The table was covered with papers, leather scraps, and an empty tin that might have contained coffee a week ago. The floor had not seen a broom in longer than she cared to imagine. A bookshelf held 24 volumes that were coated in dust, and the fireplace was cold. Clara stood in the doorway and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Ethan shifted his weight behind her. "I did mention that I needed a housekeeper. You mentioned it. You did not, however, prepare me for the full scale of the emergency." She turned to face him. "Where is my room?" He led her down a tight hallway to a small room at the end. It was half full of crates, a broken saddle, coils of rope, and what looked to be a dismantled fence gate that was leaning against the wall. "I will clear it out tomorrow," he said. "First thing." Clara looked at the narrow bed that was pushed against the far wall, the one clear surface in all the chaos. A folded quilt was sitting on the mattress, and she could tell by the creases that someone, probably Ethan, had placed it there recently. It had been done in a hurry, as if he had somehow known that he might be bringing someone home today. "Did you plan this?" she asked him sharply. Going to the depot. Did you know Pratt was going to turn me away? Ethan's expression remained unchanged. No, I went to pick up a shipment of wire for the fencing. Guthrie told me what had happened when I walked in. And you decided on the spot to offer a complete stranger your home. I decided to offer a woman in trouble a choice she did not have 5 minutes before. He held her gaze. There is nothing more to it than that. Clara wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe him so much that the feeling itself made her suspicious. She had trusted Douglas Pratt's letters for 6 months, with his careful descriptions of his ranch, his promises of a partnership, and his flattering requests for a woman of education and refinement. Every single word had been a lie wrapped in polite language. I will take the room, she said, and I will start earning my keep tonight. You do not have to. I know I do not have to. I want to. If I'm going to sleep under your roof, I am going to contribute to it before I close my eyes. Model. She unpinned her bonnet and put it on a nail hanging by the door. Where do y'all keep the flour? Ethan just looked at her a second. Then he motioned with his head toward the kitchen. Pantry's through the back, flowers in the barrel. Might be weevils in it. There are always weevils, Clara said, and brushed right past him. She cooked that first supper with her jaws set tight and her sleeves rolled high. It was beans, salt pork, and cornbread made from flour she had to sift twice to get the worst of the bugs out. It was not a fancy meal. It was not supposed to be. It was meant to be hot and on the table, and to prove she was worth a damn. When Ethan and Miguel came inside from the evening chores, they both just stopped in the doorway. The table was clear of junk, wiped clean and set with 3 plates. A fire was going in the hearth. The smell of real food filled a house that plainly had not smelled that good in a long time. Miguel sat right down without a word and ate like a fellow who had forgotten what a cooked meal was. Ethan ate slower, watching Clara over the top of his coffee cup with a look she could not figure out. This is good, Miguel said. It was the most he had said at one time since she got there. Thank you, Clara told him. Tomorrow, I will see what else is in that pantry, if there is anything left alive in it. Miguel nearly cracked a smile. Nearly. Ethan put his cup down on the table. We ought to talk about what happens in town. Clara looked straight at him. You mean the fact that you told Mr. Guthrie I am your wife? Word gets around mighty fast in Silver Bluff. By sunup, the whole town will know. Then by sunup, the whole town will believe a lie. Ethan leaned his chair back. It does not have to stay a lie, but it does not have to be true tomorrow neither. Right now, all that matters is what folks think, and what they think is going to keep us both safe. Protect you from men like Pratt and Harrove. Clara said, You already explained that part. But what else am I protected from? From everything a woman on her own faces in this territory. His voice got low. You are educated, you are young, and you came here as a mail-order bride who got sent back. Half the men in Silver Bluff are going to see that as a chance. The other half will just see it as a good show. You do not want either one. The plain way he said it stung. But Clara could not argue because it was the truth. She had seen the way Guthrie looked at her, not mean, but with a kind of pity, sure as anything that her fix was temporary and bad. She had heard what he really meant. Women like you do not last long out here by themselves. So we keep up the story, Clara said. We keep up the arrangement. What comes of it is up to us. Clara looked over at Miguel, who was eating his cornbread with a focus that told her he was hearing every single word while making like he was not. Mr. Reyes, she said, what is your thinking on all this? Miguel chewed, swallowed his bite, and met her gaze. I think Ethan has been by himself for too long, and this house needed a woman's touch about 3 years ago. He stopped for a second. I also think you ought to know that the last girl Pratt turned away ended up working at the saloon till she saved enough for a ticket back east. Took her 7 months. They were not good months. The silence that came after was heavy. Thank you for being honest with me, Clara said in a quiet voice. De nada, Miguel answered, and went back to his supper. That night, all alone in her little room where a busted saddle had been moved but crates were still stacked up on the wall, Clara sat on the edge of that narrow bed. She pressed her hands together so hard her knuckles turned white. She did not cry, but in the dark she let herself feel the whole weight of what had happened. 24 hours ago, she was Clara Whitfield from Philadelphia, a mail-order bride on her way to meet the man who was supposed to be her husband. Now she was Clara Whitfield from nowhere special, living in a stranger's house with a borrowed name, playing a part in a show she never even tried out for. She took Douglas Pratt's letter out of her pocket and read it one last time. Too opinionated, too sharp-tongued. She folded it up neat, opened the little door on the hallway stove, and fed it right to the hot coals. She watched the paper curl up, turn black, and just vanish. She cleared her throat. Then she went back to her room and slept better than she had in months. The next 2 weeks changed her completely. Clara went at that ranch house like a general going into battle with a plan, with grit, and with no mercy at all. She scrubbed the floors till you could see the wood grain again. She put the kitchen in order, tossing out food that was too far gone, and making a list of what was left. She washed every window, mended every curtain, and beat the dust out of the rug so loud that Miguel told her she was making the horses jumpy. She found the vegetable patch on her third morning, or what was left of it. It was a fenced-in square of dry ground behind the house, all choked up with weeds, the dirt cracked and pale. "This used to grow things?" she asked. Miguel, who was fixing a harness close by, 3 years back, before the drought, before Ethan stopped having time for anything but the cattle. "Can it grow things again?" Miguel put down his work and looked that garden over with the sharp eye of a man who knew dirt like some men know books. "The soil is not dead, just plumb tuckered out. Needs compost, needs water, and needs somebody who will show up for it every day." "I will show up every day," Clara said. Miguel looked at her face for a long moment. Whatever he saw there seemed to be enough for him because he gave one nod and got to his feet. "Then I will teach you. My mother grew food in land drier than this. Chilies, tomatoes, squash. She always said the secret was just being stubborn." "I have plenty of that," Clara said. "Douglas Pratt can tell you so." Miguel laughed. It was a short, surprised kind of sound, like he had almost forgotten how to do it. From that second on, they were partners. They worked that garden together every morning before the sun got too mean. Miguel taught her about soil, how to read its color and its feel, what it was thirsty for, and what it had too much of. He taught her about water, how to use just a little, how to get it right where it mattered, and how to make every single drop count in a land that treated water like it was gold. And bit by bit, the garden started to come around. Little green shoots pushed up where there had only been dust. Clara felt a hot, wild pride for every leaf, every little vine, every tiny sign of life coming back to a piece of ground everyone had given up on. She knew what it meant. She did not need it spelled out for her. Ethan saw the changes. He saw them the way he saw everything. Quiet-like, careful, storing up every little thing he noticed till he just had to say something. "You fixed the pantry door," he said one evening, and it was not a question. The hinge was loose. "Miguel showed me how, and the bookshelf. It needed dusting. I might have put things in order while I was at it." He looked at the shelf. His books, which used to be all jammed in any which way, were now set up by their kind. History books on one side, how-to guides in the middle, and 3 storybooks on the other end that Clara had been quietly reading. "You have been reading my books," he said. "You have been ignoring them. Somebody ought to read them." He picked up the book she had left open on the chair arm. It was a worn-out copy of The Last of the Mohicans. "My mother gave me this one," he said. "I was 12. It is a good story, though Cooper's women could use a little more backbone." Ethan set the book back down and looked at her. The lamplight caught in his eyes and turned them from a pale blue to something warmer, and Clara felt a little jump in her chest that she tried her best to ignore. "Thank you," he said, "for what you have done to the house." "It is our arrangement," Clara answered, keeping her voice steady. "I am holding up my end of it. You are doing more than that." He stopped for a beat. "You are making it a home again." I had forgotten what that felt like. The quiet that came after was not a bad quiet. It was the quiet of two people standing on the edge of something they were not ready to put a name to yet. Clara spoke first. "We need to get supplies. The flower situation is dire. And I need some fabric for curtains in the front room." "Saturday," Ethan said. "We will go into town." Saturday showed up with problems Clara had not counted on. They rode into Silver Bluff on the wagon. Clara wore her best dress, the navy blue one, all pressed and mended, and Ethan had on a clean shirt with his hat brushed off. They looked, Clara realized, exactly like what they were pretending to be. A husband and wife coming to town for supplies. Their first real test happened right there in front of the saloon. A big fella with a face as red as a sunset and a booming voice hollered from the porch rail, "Calloway, I hear you took on Pratt's leftover." Ethan's hands clenched the reins so tight his knuckles went white. Clara felt him get wound up tighter than a spool of thread beside her, and she knew right then he was fixing to climb down and start something that would land them both in hot water. She put her hand on his arm, a touch as light as a feather but firm with purpose. "I'm not the least bit embarrassed to be turned down by a man with such poor sense," Clara said, her voice ringing clear enough for the whole street to hear. "And I'd think twice about how you speak of a lady, sir." The big man's jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. Somebody on the boardwalk chuckled, and the fella just shuffled back into the saloon, his pride all banged up. Ethan just looked at her, stunned. "You didn't have to do that," he finally said. "Neither did you," she replied. "That's why I stopped you." She took her hand from his arm, and both of them tried to act like they hadn't noticed how long it had stayed there. Over at the general store, the owner, a skinny man with spectacles named Howell, leaned over the counter to speak low to Clara. "Pratt is a mean old fool, Mrs. Calloway. Whatever this arrangement is, you've ended up with a fine man. The best in this whole valley, if you ask some folks." Clara just thanked him and didn't bother to correct him about the name. Mrs. Calloway. It settled on her like a brand-new coat she hadn't picked out but was expected to wear for all to see. Down at the dress shop, Mrs. Pennington, a woman built sturdy with kind eyes and strong opinions she never tried to hide, announced to the whole room that Douglas Pratt wouldn't recognize a quality woman if she poured him sweet tea in his own house. "You tell Ethan I said he's the smartest man in Silver Bluff." Clara was learning something she never saw coming. This town was on her side. Not because they had any idea who she was, but because they sure knew who Pratt was. And no matter what folks thought about their sudden wedding, they much preferred the thought of Clara with Ethan than with the man who had cast her off like a spoiled piece of fruit. The meeting she had been dreading took place on the post office steps. Franklin Hargrove stood there, tall and dressed to the nines, carrying himself with the easy power of a man who owned other people's futures. He looked Clara up and down the way a banker sizes up a piece of land, figuring its worth and weighing the risk. "Calloway," he said. His voice was as smooth and pleasant as a rattlesnake's scales. "I don't think we've had the pleasure." Ethan's whole body shifted. It was a small thing, just a squaring of his shoulders and a change in his stance. But to Clara, it felt like the air pressure dropping right before a big storm. "Franklin, this is my wife, Clara. Clara, this is Franklin Hargrove. He owns the bank." Hargrove reached out his hand. When Clara shook it, all she felt was cold. "A pleasure, Mrs. Calloway. I didn't realize Ethan was shopping for a wife." "Some things don't need shopping for, Mr. Hargrove," Clara answered. "They just happen." Hargrove's smile was all mouth and no eyes. "Indeed. Well, I do hope you enjoy the Redstone. It is a demanding piece of property. Ethan has been having a hard time with it all by himself for a while now." The meaning behind his words was plain as day. "The ranch is going under, and your husband is too proud to say so." "The Redstone is doing just fine," Clara said steady. "But I do appreciate your concern." Hargrove held her gaze for a second too long, then tipped his hat and walked on by. Clara watched him leave, a cold knot forming in her stomach. That man was trouble, more trouble than Pratt, who was just loud and clumsy with his meanness. Hargrove was the kind of man who could ruin you with a pen in a little bit of time. Ethan was quiet for the good long while on the ride home. Finally, he spoke up. Hargrove is going to be a problem. He already is one, Clara corrected him. He was taking my measure back there, trying to decide if I make you stronger or weaker. Ethan shot a look at her. And which way do you reckon he's leaning? Clara kept her eyes fixed on the long dirt road stretching out in front of them. He hasn't made up his mind yet. That means it is up to us to make sure he comes to the right conclusion. Ethan didn't say a word, but when the wagon lurched into a deep rut, Clara braced herself, and his hand shot out to steady her. He grabbed her arm and held on tight until the wagon was level again. "Sorry," he said, letting go. "Rough patch." "Yes," Clara agreed, her arm still tingling where his fingers had been. "Rough patch." That evening, after Miguel had headed to the bunkhouse and a deep quiet had settled over the home, Clara sat on the porch, just listening to the silence. It was nothing like the quiet back in Philadelphia, which was always full of distant city sounds, humming with too many lives packed in too close. This was the quiet of wide open country, huge and alive, and it felt like a question she had no answer for. The front door creaked open behind her. Ethan came out holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her, not even asking, and settled into the chair next to hers. For a few minutes they just sat there, sipping their coffee in silence. "Ethan," Clara finally said. "Yes?" "Back there, when you told that man I was your wife, what would you have done if I had said no? If I'd decided to take the train back to Philadelphia?" He was quiet for so long she figured he wasn't going to answer at all. Then he said, "I would have taken you to the station. I'd have carried your trunk right onto the platform and made sure you got on that train safe and sound." He paused for a breath. "And then I would have come back here to the Redstone and spent a mighty long time wondering if I should have fought harder to make you stay." A tightness gripped Clara's chest. "You hardly knew me." "I knew enough." He stared out into the deep, dark night. "You meet some folks and you just know right off. This one is important. I cannot explain it, but I knew." Clara set her coffee cup down. Her hand was shaking and she hoped he couldn't see it. "I am glad I did not get on that train," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Me too." The quiet came back, but this time it was different. It was warmer now, filled with a feeling neither of them was ready to put a name to, but they could both feel it, pushing at the edges of the deal they'd made, searching for a place where the truth could finally break through. Clara stood up and went inside. At the side door, she stopped. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Clara." She shut the door between them and rested her forehead on the wood. On the other side, she heard his chair groan as he sat back down. And she knew, with a certainty that flat out scared her, that he was sitting there in the dark thinking about her, the same way she was standing in the hall thinking about him. This was not just an arrangement anymore, and that terrified her more than Douglas Pratt's rejection ever could. The calf was dying when Clara found it. She had gone out to the pasture at the first sign of light because she could not sleep, had not slept right in 3 nights, not since that talk on the porch, not since Ethan's voice in the dark said, "Some people you meet and you know right away." She had been walking the fence line, trying to walk the restlessness right out of her bones when she heard the noise. A low, desperate sound, weak and getting weaker. The mama cow was laying on her side in the grass, already gone. The calf, tiny and slick and just hours old, was struggling next to her, its legs buckling every time it tried to stand up. Clara ran. She did not think about her dress. She did not think about the mud. She fell to her knees beside that calf and pulled it to her chest, feeling the wild thumping of its little heart through its tiny ribs. The poor creature was cold, way too cold for something that ought to be alive. She whispered, "Hold on now." "You just hold on." She hauled it over to the barn. It felt like it weighed nothing at all, a scary thought that bothered her more than its dead silence. By the time she stepped inside, her arms were trembling, and the calf had stopped bleeding completely. Ethan came upon her 20 minutes later, sitting there in the hay with the little calf in her lap. She was trying to get warm milk into its mouth, dripping it from a rag she had soaked in a bucket. He just stood there in the doorway. The mama cow was gone. Clara didn't even raise her head. This little one's barely hanging on. It won't take this rag. Ethan crossed the barn in 4 long strides and knelt down next to her. His hands, quick and practiced, went over the calf, checking its gums, its breathing, and the temperature of its ears. His face said everything his words didn't need to. He said softly, "It might not make it through this." Clara's voice was so fierce it made Ethan look right up at her. "Then we'll make darn sure it has every chance it can get. Get me a bottle, a real one, not some old rag, and heat that milk up right. Body temperature, not just warm. Miguel told me a calf won't drink if it's even a little too hot." Ethan did not argue. He got to his feet and headed for the house. And when he returned with the bottle, Clara took it and got it positioned. The calf's head with a gentleness that did not match the stubborn set of her jaw. The calf refused to drink. Clara tried over and over. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Her arms started to ache from holding the little animal's head just so. Her dress was a mess of mud and spilled milk. The calf just lay limp against her, as if it had already made up its mind to follow its mother. "Clara," Ethan's voice was gentle. "Sometimes they just do not." She cut him off without looking at him. "Do not you dare tell me that sometimes they die. I know that sometimes they die. My brother was sick for 2 years and everybody told me that sometimes children die. I refused to believe it then, and I refuse to believe it now." The raw pain in her voice made him fall silent. She shifted her grip on the calf. She tipped the bottle a different way. She gently pushed the nipple against the calf's lips and squeezed just enough for a single drop of milk to touch its tongue. The calf's mouth twitched. Clara squeezed again. Another drop. The calf's lips parted. Its tongue moved. It was a weak, unsteady movement, but it was something. Clara held her breath and squeezed one more time. And that time the calf latched on. It drank slow at first, then with more and more purpose, its small body pushing against Clara's chest like she was the only solid thing left in its entire world. Clara finally let out a breath she felt like that she had held on to for so many years. Ethan sat back on his heels. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice low. "Language," Clara murmured. But a real smile was spreading across her face, the kind that cracked open a part of her she had kept locked away. "What do you think you'll name him?" Ethan asked. Clara looked down at the calf nursing there in her arms. "Gideon," she said. "He's named after a man in one of your books, the one who flat out refused to give up, even when the whole world was against him." Ethan just watched her for a long moment. Clara could feel his gaze on her like sunlight coming through a window pane. It was warm, focused, and something she just could not ignore. "Gideon, it is," he said. In the days that followed, Gideon turned into Clara's little shadow. She fed him every 4 hours, all through the night, in the wee hours of the morning, and during the blistering midday heat. She would carry bottles out to the pasture, sit with him in the barn, and let him follow her around the yard on legs that got stronger with every single day. The calf tagged along behind her like a puppy dog, always pressing his nose against her skirt, bleating if she got too far ahead. Miguel watched all this with a quiet, knowing grin. "He thinks you're his mama," he told Clara one morning. "I suppose I am, in a way," she answered, scratching Gideon right behind his ears. "We are both just transplants, trying to learn how to survive out here in a place that's not our own." "You are doing a whole lot more than just surviving, Senora," Miguel said. He used that word on purpose. Senora, not señorita. It was the very first time he had acknowledged the charade of her marriage without a hint of sarcasm. Clara looked over at him. "Miguel, can I ask you a personal question?" "You can always ask." I will decide if I am going to answer. How long have you known Ethan? 8 years, ever since he bought the Redstone. I came along with the place. The Garretts hired me on when I was just a boy, and I stayed on after they passed away. Miguel's voice got a little softer when he talked about the Garretts. They were a good family. The influenza came through and took the father and both his sons in the same winter. Ethan bought this ranch from the daughter. He paid her a fair price when he surely could have lowballed her. That sounds just like him. It is him. That is the whole point. Miguel put down the tool he had been sharpening and looked Clara straight in the eye. He is a good man, Clara. Better than he lets on. Better than he even knows himself. But he has spent so many years out here by himself that he has forgotten how to ask for the things he needs. And what is it that he needs? Miguel smiled, a rare and genuine smile that completely changed his weathered face. You already know the answer to that. You have known it since the moment you stopped him from jumping off that wagon right outside the saloon. Clara opened her mouth to say something, but the sound of horse hooves pounding the dirt cut through the quiet morning air. A rider was coming toward the ranch at a full gallop, not from town but from the north, from the direction where the Colton ranch bordered Ethan's land. Ethan came out of the barn as soon as he heard it, his hand dropping to his hip out of pure instinct, right where a holster would have been if he was wearing one. The rider was Tom Colton, a rancher in his 40s, built like a barrel with a face that looked like it was carved from the same rock as the mountains. He pulled his horse up so hard the animal sidestepped, lathered in sweat. "Calloway, we have got a problem." Ethan stepped forward. "What kind of problem we talking about?" "Rustlers hit my south herd last night. Took 30 head. Their tracks are leading up toward the pass." Clara watched Ethan's whole face change. The quiet, reserved man she had been living with for weeks just disappeared. And in his place was someone harder, sharper. A man who knew that out in this territory, stolen cattle meant the difference between making it and going under. "How many men you got?" Ethan asked. "3, counting me. Not nearly enough to run them down and still protect the rest of my herd. Need riders." Ethan turned his head toward Miguel. Not a single word was spoken, but Miguel was already headed to the bunkhouse for his rifle and his saddle. "I will ride with you," Ethan told Colton. "Just give me 10 minutes. Make it 5. Colton wheeled his horse around and rode back toward the gate. Ethan strode toward the house, and Clara followed him. "How long do you think you will be gone?" she asked. "A day, maybe 2. It all depends on how far they have driven that herd." He pulled his rifle down from above the mantel and checked the action with hands that knew exactly what they were doing. "Miguel is coming with me. You will be here all alone. I can manage being alone. I know you can." He shoved ammunition into his pockets and reached for his heavy coat, and then he just stopped. He stood perfectly still for a moment with his back to her. When he turned around, his expression had changed yet again. It was not hard anymore, but open in a way she had never seen before. "Clara, when I get back, we ought to talk about this arrangement, about making it more permanent, if that is something you would be agreeable to." Her heart just slammed against her ribs. "Ethan, you do not have to answer me right now. Just think on it." He held her gaze for a second that stretched on longer than either of them expected. And then he was moving, out the door and across the yard, swinging onto his horse with the smooth ease of a man who had spent half his life in a saddle. Miguel rode up right beside him. He looked over at Clara standing on the porch and just touched the brim of his hat. "We will be back, Senora. Be sure to lock the doors at night." They were gone in a swirl of dust, and Clara stood there all alone on the porch of a ranch she did not own, wearing a name she had not truly earned, and holding a question in her heart that burned hotter than any rejection from Douglas Pratt had ever made her feel. More permanent. He had said it like a man testing thin ice, real careful, ready to pull back at the first sign of a crack. But Clara had heard what he was not saying. She had heard it in the way his voice changed when he spoke to her, in the way his eyes would follow her when she moved across a room, in the way his hand had caught her arm on that wagon and held on for just a breath longer than it needed to. Ethan Calloway was falling in love with her. And the terrifying truth, the one she had been running from since that night on the porch, was that she was falling for him just as fast. He was gone for 3 days, not 2. 3 whole days where Clara ran the Redstone all by herself. She fed all the livestock, hauled water, kept the garden from dying, and sat up every single night with Ethan's rifle laid across her knees, listening to every little sound the darkness made. She was not scared. She was something much worse. She was waiting, and the waiting was eating her alive. The second night on the ranch, Clara heard the drumming of hooves on the road that ran past the edge of the spread. With a soft puff of breath, she killed the lamp flame and pressed herself flat against the wall. She held the rifle just like Miguel showed her, the wooden stock firm against her shoulder, her finger resting on the frame, away from the trigger, until it was time. The riders galloped on by without slowing, but Clara stayed put in the blackness for another hour, until the trembling in her hands finally stopped. On the morning of the third day, a plume of dust rose on the long, flat line of the horizon, and a cold knot formed in her stomach. 2 riders. She counted them once, then again, before snatching up the rifle and striding out to the fence line. It was Ethan and Miguel, looking worn down to the bone. Miguel had a makeshift bandage wrapped around his left arm. A tear ran down the shoulder of Ethan's shirt, and his face was a mask of pure exhaustion. But he sat tall in the saddle, his eyes locked on hers from across the pasture before his horse even made it to the gate. He swung down and started walking her way. His boots were thick with mud, and his hat was gone. A deep purple bruise was spreading over his left cheekbone, one that was not there 3 days earlier. "What in the world happened?" Clara asked, her voice tight. "We got our cattle back," he said. "Well, most of them." He stopped about 3 feet away, looking like he was not sure if he was welcome. "Colton took a bullet to the leg. He'll pull through. Miguel got caught by a knife on his arm. He is going to need some stitches." Clara's gaze shifted past Ethan to Miguel, who was easing himself off his horse with the slow, deliberate motions of a man trying not to scream. "Get inside," she ordered. "Both of y'all, right now." She set to stitching Miguel's arm on the kitchen table while Ethan sat opposite them. He sipped his coffee, his eyes following her every move with an intensity she could not quite figure out through her own laser focus. Miguel never so much as flinched. His own eyes stayed on Clara's hands, so steady and sure, as she guided the needle through his skin with the same deep concentration she had given to the dying calf. When she tied off the last stitch, he glanced at Ethan and said a few words in Spanish that were too quick for Clara to understand. "What did he say?" she asked. A faint blush crept up Ethan's ears. "He said that you have good hands." The look on Miguel's face told her that was a mighty loose translation. But Clara decided to let it be. After Miguel had gone to the bunkhouse to get some sleep, Clara finally turned her attention to Ethan. "You could have gotten yourself killed, but I did not. That is not the point, Ethan. You took off after armed rustlers with only a 5-minute warning and a vague promise to talk when you returned. And I was left here for 3 days, not having any idea if you were dead or alive." "Clara, 3 days," her voice broke on the words. And with that crack, every last thing she had been holding inside came flooding out. The terror, the fury, and the overwhelming, suffocating relief of seeing him ride back in one piece. "I sat in this very house with your rifle, listening to strangers ride by in the dead of night. And I had no idea if the next person to knock on that door would be you or someone coming to tell me you were lying dead in some dusty ditch." Ethan just stared at her. She could practically see the gears turning in his head as he understood what she was truly saying. It was not just about frustration. It was about the raw fear underneath it all. The fear of a woman who finally had something she could not bear to lose. "I am sorry," he said, his voice low. You should have told me what you were riding straight into. You should have given me some idea of what to expect. You treat me like I am your partner in running this place, But you leave me completely in the dark when it truly matters. And I will not stand for that, Ethan. Not from you. Not after everything we have been through. He pushed himself to his feet slowly. He walked across the kitchen floor until he stood right before her, so close she could see the ugly bloom of the bruise on his cheek, the dried speck of blood at his hairline, and the weariness etched into the lines around his eyes. "You are right," he said. "I am truly sorry. It will not happen again. Promise me." "I promise." They stood there just inches apart, and Clara could feel the warmth coming off him, and smell the trail dust clinging to his clothes, and see the steady pulse beating in his throat. His gaze fell to her mouth for a second before meeting her eyes again, and she saw him wrestle with the urge to close the small gap between them. "You said we had to talk," Clara whispered, her mind on their arrangement. "I did say that." "Well then, talk." Ethan drew a long breath. "Not right now. Not looking like this. I smell of horse and a whole heap of trouble. And you deserve more than a proposal from a man who looks like he just lost a fight with a mountain." A small laugh escaped Clara's lips. The sound seemed to startle them both. "You are stalling, Ethan Calloway. I am waiting for the proper moment." "And just when might that be?" A slight smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was that little crooked smile she found herself watching for. "Founders' Day. The whole town's having a big celebration next Saturday. There will be dancing, plenty of food. The entire territory will be there." He paused. "Come with me. Not as my housekeeper. Not as some part of a business deal. Come with me because I'm asking you to." Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Are you asking me to go to a dance with you, Mr. Calloway?" "I am asking you to let me court you properly." His voice grew quiet. "You came all this way expecting a man who would treat you with honesty and respect. Instead, you got turned away. I want to give you what you were promised. A man who sees you for who you are and chooses you, not because it is convenient, not as part of a plan. Then because of what?" He held her gaze, and she could read the answer in his tired face. But he did not speak the words, not just yet. He was saving them, she realized, holding them back like a card player holds his best card, until the stakes are highest. "Saturday," he said. "Wear that blue dress." "It is the only dress I have." And with that, the moment was settled. He took a step back, and the air between them suddenly felt empty and cool. "I need to get cleaned up. We should check on Miguel's arm again in the morning." He walked past her, heading for the hallway, but stopped at the doorway without turning around. "I thought about you every single night I was out on that trail, just in case you were wondering." And then he was gone. Clara stood all alone in the kitchen, her hands balled into fists at her sides, with the echo of his words filling the quiet room like sunshine. Saturday came upon them like the gentle sigh of a long-awaited rain. Clara passed the morning with Mrs. Pennington, who helped her alter the blue silk dress she had brought all the way from Philadelphia, the very one she had planned to wear for Douglas Pratt. Mrs. Pennington took in the waist, adjusted the sleeves, and then stood back, placing her hands on her hips with a satisfied look. "That Pratt fella would have swallowed his own tongue," she declared. "Ethan is going to forget how to form words." She was not wrong. When Clara emerged from her bedroom that evening, Ethan was waiting in the main room dressed in a dark suit, a crisp white shirt, and a simple string tie. He looked like a completely different person. All the dust and sweat had been washed away, revealing the man Clara had sensed was there but had never truly seen. He was a handsome man, but not in the slick, polished way of the men back in Philadelphia. His was the handsomeness of the land itself, strong, weathered, and deeply honest. He saw her, and his mouth fell open. He closed it, then opened it again. "You look," he started, but his voice trailed off. Clara waited. I do not have the word for it, he finally admitted. That might just be the finest compliment I have ever received, Clara replied with a smile. Shall we go? The celebration was everything Ethan had described and then some. It seemed the whole territory had shown up. There were ranchers, shopkeepers, and miners with their wives and children. The town square was buzzing with fiddle music and happy voices, and the delicious smell of roasting meat hung in the air. Clara was quickly pulled into a whirl of introductions, shaking hands and trying to keep up with conversations that flew by. Mrs. Colton grabbed both of Clara's hands and told her, "My Tom would have died out there if not for Ethan and Miguel. You sent me back my husband. I will never forget that." Clara just shook her head. Ethan was the one who made that choice, not me. A man makes better choices when he has a good woman to come home to, Mrs. Colton said, her eyes knowing. You are that woman for him, whether you realize it yet or not. Those words settled deep in Clara's chest and took root there. Later, as lanterns were lit against the twilight and the fiddle music softened to a slow tune, Ethan appeared by her side. He held out his hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Calloway?" Clara smiled and placed her hand in his. "You certainly may." He drew her near, one hand resting on the small of her back, the other holding hers, and they began to move together with a natural grace that surprised them both. He was a much better dancer than he had let on, and his hand at her waist was steady, warm, and sure. "I have been trying to figure out the right way to say this," he said softly, his voice for her ears only. "But I have never been a man for fancy speeches." "I have never needed fancy speeches, Ethan, just honesty." "Then here is the honest truth, Clara." He pulled her even closer, so close she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her own. "I want you to stay. Not as my housekeeper. I want you to be my wife, for real this time." The music seemed to fade away, becoming a distant hum. Clara's entire world shrank to the small space between their two bodies, his hand on her waist, hers on his shoulder, and the few inches of electric air that separated their faces. "I respect you," he said. "I enjoy your company. This whole ranch is better with you in it." His voice grew thick with emotion. "And I truly believe I could make you happy, if you would only let me try." Clara's eyes began to sting with unshed tears. "This is not how I pictured my life turning out." "Mine neither," he admitted. "But sometimes the path you never expected to take leads you exactly where you needed to be." Before she could give him her answer, a furious shout cut through the festive air like an axe splitting timber. "There she is!" Douglas Pratt was shoving his way through the crowd. His fine suit was a mess, his face was red with whiskey and rage, and he was pointing a finger straight at Clara as if it were a loaded pistol. "The woman who was supposed to be my wife! Stolen by Calloway before she even had the good grace to leave town." A hush fell over the crowd. Every single head turned in their direction. Ethan moved instantly, placing himself slightly in front of Clara as a shield. "You turned her away, Pratt. You left her stranded at the train depot without even the courage to say it to her face. What happened after that is none of your business." Pratt lurched a step closer, his voice getting louder. "I came back for her. The very next morning, and she was already gone. Already shacked up with you like some kind of—" "Choose your next word very, very carefully," Ethan said. His voice was deathly quiet, and that quiet was far more threatening than any yell could ever be. Pratt's jaw worked, but no sound came out. He was just drunk enough to be stupid, but just sober enough to see the clear warning in Ethan's eyes. Instead, he turned right toward Clara. "I paid for your passage out west, every last cent for that ticket." Clara stepped forward, not to get behind Ethan, but to stand right beside him. "Mr. Pratt," her voice rang out across the silent crowd like a church bell. "You paid for a train ticket. That is not the same thing as owning a person. You decided I was too opinionated without ever speaking a single word to me. You rejected me in a letter that was handed off by a station master because you did not have the courage to face me yourself. And now you stand here drunk and shouting, claiming rights you gave up the very moment you walked out that back door. Not a soul in the crowd even moved. I am not property, Clara went on. I am not some piece of freight to be claimed and sent back whenever it is convenient. I am a woman who traveled 2,000 miles on faith, and the only man who showed me any decency that day is the one standing next to me right now. She turned to Pratt, and her voice dropped to something cold and final. Your opportunity ended when you decided I was not good enough without even bothering to get to know me. Now, please excuse us. Then she turned to Ethan. All the fury just drained away from her face, and it was replaced by something bright and unguarded. I do believe you promised me another dance, Mr. Calloway. Ethan offered her his arm. The smile that broke across his face was like nothing Clara had ever seen before. It was open with no defenses, and it blazed with a joy he had spent weeks trying to keep bottled up. So I did, Mrs. Calloway. He led her back onto the dance floor, and behind them Pratt just stood there alone in a circle of silence, with the weight of the whole town's judgment pressing down on him like a heavy stone. Clara leaned in close to Ethan as the music started up again, and she whispered the words she had been carrying in her heart since that night on the porch. Since that morning with the calf, and since the 3 desperate days she had spent just waiting for him to come back home. Yes, his hand tightened on hers. Yes, yes, I will stay. I will be your wife, your real wife. She pulled back just enough to look him right in the eyes. Not because I need a place to live, and not because of some arrangement. It is because I have come to care for you, Ethan Calloway. Far more than I ever expected to. The music swelled up all around them, but neither one of them even heard it. Ethan's hand came up to touch her face. His calloused thumb traced along her cheekbone with a tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. I have been half in love with you since the first time I saw you standing at that depot, he said, with your chin held high and that letter in your hand just refusing to break. Only half? Clara whispered. The other. Ethan caught up to her in a heartbeat. He just leaned right in and rested his forehead on hers. It happened faster than anything she had ever seen. Clara let her eyes fall shut. She could feel his warm breath on her skin, his hand gentle against her cheek, and the steady, sure feeling of a man who had picked her. Not out of some mail-order book, not from a letter, and not by peeking through a window. He chose her after watching her fight and scratch and flat-out refuse to quit. When she finally opened her eyes, Douglas Pratt was nowhere in sight. She hadn't even noticed him go, and she did not care one bit. Take me home, Ethan, she said. This time, that simple word, home, meant the whole world. The wagon ride back from the Founders' Day party was the most silent trip Clara and Ethan had ever taken together. Yet it was the loudest, too. Not a single word passed between them. They did not need any. The quiet space between them was filled with everything they had just declared out on that dance floor, every truth they had laid bare for the entire territory to see. The sheer size of what was coming next seemed to press in on them from the sides of the wagon. Ethan held the reins in one hand. His other hand was on the seat between them, palm facing up, an open invitation, just like the one he had made at the train depot. He was offering, not taking. Clara looked down at that hand for a good long while. Then she laid her own hand right inside of his. His fingers folded over hers, and they were warm, steady, and certain. They rode the rest of the way just like that, linked by a simple touch that spoke more than words ever could. Back at the ranch, Miguel was sitting on the bunkhouse steps carving a piece of wood. He glanced up as the wagon rolled in, saw their joined hands, and went right back to his whittling without saying a thing. But Clara saw the small smile he was trying to push down, and she knew. By sunup, he would find some roundabout way to congratulate them without ever speaking the words out loud. Ethan walked with her all the way to the porch. He stopped right at the door, letting go of her hand, like a man releasing something mighty precious. "Reckon I ought to say good night," he said. "You probably should." "I sure don't want to." Clara felt her heart squeeze tight. I don't either, but we have waited this long. We can wait just a little longer and do this the right way. The church in town, Ethan said. 2 weeks. That is the earliest Reverend Marsh can do it. I will ride in tomorrow to set it all up. 2 weeks, Clara said back to him. The words felt like a lifetime away, and no time at all. Ethan leaned in close. For a second, she was sure he was about to kiss her, and every piece of her leaned toward him like a nail to a magnet. But he stopped himself. His face was just inches away from hers when he pressed his lips to her forehead instead. The kiss was soft and slow, filled with a kind of control that showed her just how hard it was for him to stop right there. Good night, Clara. Good night, Ethan. She stepped inside, closed the door, and just stood there in the dark hall. Her hand was pressed flat against the spot on her forehead where his lips had just been. For the first time in her whole life, she truly understood what it felt like to be chosen. Not settled for, not part of a deal, and not bought and paid for. She was chosen by a man who had seen every last one of her sharp edges and wanted her for them, not just in spite of them. The 2 weeks leading up to the wedding went by in a rush of getting ready, waiting, and a single crisis that almost brought it all crashing down. It all began with a letter. Clara was going through the mail Ethan had brought back from town when she saw it. It was a thick envelope addressed to Mrs. Ethan Calloway, with a return address she had never seen before. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened it, thinking it was just a note from one of the other ranchers' wives. Inside, there was just one sheet of paper, covered in a script she did not recognize. She read it one time. Then she read it a second time. Then she had to put it down and press her hands flat against the table because the whole room had started to feel unsteady. The letter was from a woman by the name of Sarah Lindsay. She said she lived in Cheyenne and claimed that she was Ethan Calloway's wife. It read, Mrs. Calloway, I hear you think you are married to my husband. I want to assure you that is not true. Ethan and I were married in Cheyenne 4 years ago. He deserted me and our marriage when he left for Silver Bluff. I have the papers to prove it. A marriage certificate filed with the court. Whatever deal you have made with Ethan is a fraud, and I fully intend to take legal action. Clara just stared at those words until they started to blur. Her mind started sorting through what it all meant, with the cold, clear thinking of a woman who had learned to stay calm when her world was falling to pieces. If this letter was telling the truth, then Ethan had lied to her about it all. About being alone, about needing a wife, about their arrangement being simple and honest. He had stood right there on that dance floor and asked her to be his real wife, all while another woman had a legal claim to him. If this letter was true, Clara was not a jilted bride who had stumbled into love. She was just a fool who had been tricked twice. She was still sitting right there at the table when Ethan came in from the pasture. He saw the letter. He saw the look on her face. And something in his eyes changed. It was not guilt, but it was recognition. The look of a man watching a storm he always knew was coming finally break over the land. Where did you get that? He asked her. It came in the mail. It was addressed to me. Clara's voice was perfectly level. It was the kind of calm that comes just before everything shatters. Is it true? Ethan pulled out a chair from the table and sat down across from her. He did not try to take the letter. He did not try to touch her. Some of it is, he said. Clara felt like the floor had just vanished from under her feet. Some of it. I was married in Cheyenne 4 years ago. Her name is Sarah Lindsay. He said it straight without so much as a flinch, but Clara could see the muscle working in his jaw, see how his hands were gripping the table's edge. It lasted all of 3 months. 3 months. She ran off with a railroad man, took every cent I had saved, and just disappeared. I filed for a dissolution of marriage, what they call a divorce out here. 6 months after that, the court approved it. Clara's hands were trembling. She pushed them down harder onto the tabletop. Then why is this woman writing to me claiming you are still married to her? Because she is after money. Ethan's voice was steady, but there was a fire underneath it. An old, bitter anger, the kind you get when someone you put your faith in cuts you deep. Sarah has been sending me letters for a year. Ever since she got word I was doing all right with the Redstone Ranch. She wants me to pay her off, give her money to just go away and quit stirring up trouble. I told her no. So she is just trying a new way to get at me. By writing to you. By trying to scare you off. If you run, I am all alone again. That makes me an easier target, easier to squeeze. Clara stared hard at him. And you never once thought you should tell me about any of this? The question just hung there in the quiet between them, sharp as a knife. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, that guarded look she knew so well was gone. In its place was something raw and wide open. I was scared. If I told you about Sarah, about a marriage that failed, about the divorce, about her demanding money, I figured you would think I was damaged goods. Just another man with a tangled past making you another tangled offer. So you just did not tell me. That is a lie. Yes. He did not try to argue it. He did not make a single excuse. He just sat there and took the weight of her words like a man who knows he earned them. And I am sorry. You asked me to be nothing but honest with you, and I failed. I was trying to shield you from something ugly, and instead I just made it even worse. Clara shoved her chair back from the table. She got up and walked over to the window, putting some room between them. It was a real distance, just like the gaping hole that had just torn open inside her chest. I need to see the divorce papers, she said. They're in a lockbox under my bed. I will go get them for you right now. And he did. He carried the metal box over to the table, turned a small key from his vest pocket in the lock, and laid a bundle of papers right in front of her. Clara read every word with the same sharp focus she had given Mr. Pratt's rejection letter back on that depot platform. She went through them 3 times, making sure she missed nothing. The divorce was official. It was filed in the territorial court down in Cheyenne, granted because his wife had abandoned him, and signed by a judge. The date on it was from 3.5 years ago. Ethan Calloway was, by law, a single man, plain and simple. Clara put the papers down on the table. The wave of relief that washed over her was so strong it almost made her head spin. But that anger was still there. It sat in her belly like a hot coal, burning and hard. You should have told me, she said one more time. I know. Before that dance, before you asked me to marry you, before I stood up in front of this whole town and told Douglas Pratt that you were the only good man I had ever met. I know, Clara, because if that woman had shown up here in Silver Bluff before I saw these papers, if she had stood up in that crowd and called me a liar, I would not have had a single thing to say for myself. Not a thing. I would have looked like a fool all over again. Ethan flinched. It was just a small movement, but Clara saw it. She knew her words hit him right where she had aimed. What do you need me to do? He asked, his voice low. Clara looked at him from across the table. This was the man she had picked. This was the man she was so mad at. This was the man whose face still made her heart jump, even when all she wanted to do was break a dinner plate over his head. I want you to sit down and write a letter to this woman tonight. I want you to tell her that the divorce is final, that she has no claim on you, and that if she ever tries to contact either one of us again, you will hire a lawyer. Clara took a breath. And I want you to promise me right here and now, on everything you hold dear, that you are not keeping any more secrets. There is nothing else you are trying to protect me from. Nothing else that is going to jump out and bite us. There is nothing else, Ethan said. I swear it. On what? On the Redstone. On my mother's grave. On... His voice broke, and that sound split through Clara's anger like a crack in stone. On whatever this is between us, whatever you want to call what we have, that is what I swear on. Clara stared right into his eyes for a long, heavy moment. She could see the fear plain as day. He was not scared of Sarah Lindsay, and he was not scared of losing his ranch. He was scared of losing her. It was written all over his face, as clear as black ink on a white page. And it was the most honest thing she had ever seen from him. "Write the letter," she said. "I will mail it myself in the morning." She walked right out of the kitchen, down the hall, and into her room. She shut the door behind her. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and for the very first time since she had stepped off that train in Silver Bluff, Clara Whitfield let herself cry. She was not crying because she was broken. She was crying because she had come so close to losing something she never even knew she needed, until it was almost ripped away. 20 minutes later, she heard a soft knock. "Clara." It was Ethan's voice, muffled by the wood of the door. "The letter is written. I left it on the kitchen table. You can read it before I send it." She did not answer him. "I am sorry," he said. "I am more sorry than I have the words to tell you, but I need you to know that everything I said at that dance was the God's honest truth. Every single word. There was nothing fake about how I feel for you. The only lie was the one I told by not speaking up, and I will spend the rest of my days making that right, if you will give me the chance." Silence. "Good night, Clara." She heard his footsteps walking away down the hall. She heard the soft creak of his bedroom door closing. She buried her face in the quilt and just breathed until the trembling finally stopped. Then she got up, walked back to the kitchen, and read the letter he had written to Sarah Lindsay. It was straightforward, firm, and final. There was no anger, and there were no threats. Just the simple facts laid out by a man who had absolutely nothing to hide. Clara added a single line at the very bottom, in her own hand. "Mrs. Lindsay, I have read the divorce papers myself. Your claim has no legal ground. I suggest you put your efforts into something else. Clara Calloway." She signed it with a name she had not quite earned by law, but one she was fully planning on taking. The wedding went on just as they had planned, 2 weeks to the day after the Founders' Day dance. Clara walked into Silver Bluff's little church on a Tuesday morning with wildflowers tucked in her hair, wearing the same blue silk dress that had now seen her through the worst night and the best day of her life. Miguel stood up as his witness. He had on a clean shirt that Clara had ironed for him that very morning, and his boots were so shiny she figured it must have taken him a solid hour to get them that way. When she had handed him the shirt and told him she wanted him right up there beside them, something happened to his face she had never seen before. It just crumbled for a heartbeat before he got it back under control and gave a sharp nod. "It would be my honor, Senora," he had said, and his voice came out all rough. Mrs. Pennington and Mrs. Colton sat right there in the front pew. Tom Colton was next to his wife, his bad leg propped up on a pillow, and his arm resting around her shoulders. About a dozen other ranchers and their families filled up the small building. These were people Clara had only known for a few weeks, not a lifetime, but they had welcomed her with a kindness that still took her by surprise. Ethan was waiting at the altar in his dark suit, the same one he had worn to the dance. He was clean-shaven, his hair was combed, and his boots were polished. He looked like a man who had gotten ready for this day with the same quiet care he put into everything else. No fuss, just steady and thorough. When Clara got to the altar, Ethan took her hand. His own hand was trembling, and it was the first time she had ever felt him shake. That little tremor told her everything she needed to know about what this day meant to him. Reverend Marsh said the words. Clara said her vows in a clear voice that everyone in the back could hear. Ethan said his in a voice that was steady as a rock, until the very end when he said, "I do." The words came out all thick, like they had to fight their way out of his throat. When the Reverend announced that they were husband and wife, Ethan kissed her. It was not the gentle kiss on the forehead he had given her 2 weeks ago. This was a true kiss, full of tenderness and promises, and Clara felt it from the top of her head clear down to the soles of her feet. As they turned to face the small crowd, Clara's eyes scanned the little church. And then she stopped. Douglas Pratt was standing at the very back, right by the door. Their eyes met clear across the room. The look on Pratt's face was not anger. It was not the look of a drunk man. It was something much worse. It was regret. The kind of deep, quiet regret a man feels when he finally understands the true value of what he tossed aside and knows good and well he can never get it back. Clara held his gaze for 1 second, no more. She did not nod. She did not smile. She simply turned back to Ethan and laid her hand on his arm. "Is everything all right?" Ethan asked her. "Everything is perfect," Clara said. Behind them, the church door opened, and then clicked shut. Pratt was gone. That night, in the room that had once been just hers, and was now theirs, Clara and Ethan came to know each other with a kind of tenderness that neither of them had been expecting. He was so gentle with her, almost painfully and respectfully so, and she knew that his gentleness was not a sign of being unsure, but a sign of being grateful. He was grateful she was there, grateful she had forgiven him, grateful she had decided to stay, even after finding out about the secrets he had kept hidden. Later, as she was lying in the circle of his arms with her head resting on his chest and his steady heartbeat under her ear, Clara said, "I ought to write Douglas Pratt a thank you note." Ethan's chest rumbled with a low chuckle. "And why would you do that?" "Because if he had not turned me away, I never would have ended up finding you." His arms tightened around her. "His loss is my gain." He pressed a kiss to the side of her head. "Though I like to think we would have found our way to each other one way or another, even if things had started out different." "Perhaps," Clara said. "But I have grown mighty fond of our story, just the way it happened." A woman left at the depot, rescued by a cowboy with a business deal. "Not rescued," Ethan corrected her softly. "Offered a chance that you were brave enough to take." Clara smiled against his skin. "Yes, there is a big difference." The weeks that passed after that wove Clara deeper into the life of the Redstone Ranch and Silver Bluff, until she could not even picture a life that did not have both. The garden thrived with her and Miguel working side by side. The tomatoes turned red on the vine, the squash grew fat, and the sweet smell of herbs filled the kitchen whenever she crushed the leaves between her fingers. The herd got bigger. Ethan hired on 2 new hands, a couple of young brothers from Montana named Jack and Owen. They worked hard and ate even harder, and they treated Clara with the kind of shy respect you see in boys who were raised right. Miguel was made foreman. When Ethan told him the news, the older man just stood there completely still for a moment, then gave one single nod. He walked out to the barn and did not come back for a whole hour. Clara found him later sitting on a bale of hay, and his eyes were red-rimmed. "My mother would have been proud," he said. "She came to this country with nothing. She spent her life cleaning other people's houses. And now her son is running a ranch." Clara sat down next to him. "She would be proud of the man you are, Miguel, not just the job you have." He patted her hand just once, a quick, rough gesture that men use when they want to show you they care but do not have the words for it. Soon. And that was all that needed saying. The Redstone Ranch changed, and the change was more than just new curtains and hot meals. It turned into a place people came to visit. Ranchers would stop by for a cup of coffee. Their wives would bring over pies and news. Children would run wild in the yard while their parents talked about cattle prices on the front porch. The house that had once felt like a quiet, lonely fort became a gathering place, a warm spot in a valley that did not have enough of them. And Clara and Ethan's marriage put down roots that went deep, deep down inside them. They argued, you better believe they argued. She had her own mind, and he was as stubborn as a mule. And when you put 2 folks with that much fire together, you are bound to get some sparks. They argued over money and cattle, and if they should fix the barn roof or the fences first. They argued over Hargrove trying to change the water rights agreement again. They argued about Clara wanting to ride out and check the herds all by herself, which Ethan said was too dangerous, and Clara said was none of his business. But they never once went to sleep angry. That was a rule Clara made on their second night as man and wife. And Ethan kept that promise, even if it meant they had to sit up past midnight, talking through whatever got between them until it was all settled. "You are the most headstrong woman I have ever known," he told her one night, after a real tough disagreement about the money for the house. "And you went and married me anyway," Clara shot back. So does that make one of us a fool and the other one determined? Which one am I? I will let you figure that out. She gave him a kiss, but figure it out fast. I am tired. In November, the air got a sharp bite to it, and the morning started with frost painting the windows. Clara sat on the side of their bed one evening while Ethan was pulling off his boots. And then she shared the secret she had been keeping for 2 long weeks, just waiting for the perfect time to be certain. We're going to have a baby, she told him. The little one should be here late next spring. Ethan froze right where he stood. His boot hit the floorboards with a loud thud that echoed in the quiet room. He just looked at her, and Clara saw more feelings cross his face in 5 seconds than she had seen in the last 5 months. There was shock, then doubt, a little fear, then wonder, and finally a joy so real and open it made his eyes sparkle. He crossed the room in 2 long steps. He got down on one knee in front of her and took both of her hands in his. His own were trembling again, the same way she felt them tremble at the altar. A family, he whispered, his voice catching on the word. Our own family. It's always been a family, Clara said softly, putting his hand on her belly. This just makes it feel more whole. Ethan rested his forehead against her hands and stayed that way for a good long while. Clara felt his shoulders begin to shake and knew he was crying, and in that moment she loved him more than she ever thought a person could love another. That very same fall, news traveled that Douglas Pratt had sold off all his holdings to Franklin Harrove and lit out from Silver Bluff, headed for California. Guthrie down at the depot was the one who mentioned it, while Clara was getting the mail. Just packed his bags and left, the old man said. Never said a word of goodbye to anyone. Clara put the letters under her arm and walked over to the wagon where Ethan was waiting. She pulled herself up onto the seat beside him and said, Pratt is gone. Took off for California. Ethan stayed quiet for a minute. How do you feel about that? Clara thought about his question, giving it the serious thought it needed. She remembered the crumpled-up letter on the train platform. She remembered the 3 hours she waited for a man who was just watching her from a window, deciding she was not good enough. She remembered the word rejected, and how it had trailed her all the way across the country like her own shadow. I feel nothing, she said, and she truly meant every word of it. It was not forgiveness, because that was too kind. It was not bitterness, because that cost too much. It was just a clean, empty space where a heavy burden she had been hauling around without even knowing it used to be. Good, Ethan said. He clucked to the horses, and they headed for home in the November chill, their shoulders brushing against each other, the road stretching out before them, and a child growing in the quiet space between Clara's own heartbeat and the future she was finally no longer afraid to face. Winter came on hard and fast that year. The first big storm blew into the Redstone in early December. It brought 3 straight days of a howling wind that screamed across the plains and piled snow so high against the doors that Ethan had to shovel them clear every single morning. Clara would stand by the window, watching him work, her hand pressed against the gentle curve of her belly where the baby had just begun to stir. They were tiny little flutters, feeling like butterfly wings beating against the inside of her skin. Quit your worrying, Miguel called to her from the kitchen, where he was fixing a bridle near the warm stove. He has been through a lot worse than this. I am not worried, Clara said. I am just trying to figure out how many different ways that man can hurt himself before noon. Miguel just snorted. Now you are starting to sound like his wife. I am his wife. Yes, Miguel's voice turned softer. You surely are. Ethan came back inside with snow in his hair and frost on his eyebrows, wearing a grin that wiped a good 10 years off his face. Barnes is holding up. The cattle are all sheltered. The new hands have enough firewood to see them through the week. He stomped his boots clean on the mat and walked over to Clara. He placed his cold hands on both sides of her belly, and she let out a little gasp. Your hands are like ice. The baby does not seem to care. He held perfectly still, just waiting. And then the flutter came again, but stronger this time. It was a clear little kick right against his palm. A look of pure wonder spread across Ethan's face. "That is our daughter," Clara said. She had no idea why she said it. A daughter. There was no way she could know that. But the feeling was certain, rooted somewhere deep inside where logic could not get to it. "How can you be so sure it is a girl?" Ethan asked. "Because she kicks, just like someone who has already made up her mind that she is going to be in charge." Ethan let out a laugh, a real deep laugh that filled up the kitchen and made Miguel just shake his head and smile. "She gets that from her mother." "She gets that from both of us," Clara corrected him. "And God help anyone who ever tries to tell her otherwise." The storm finally broke, but the winter did not let up. By January, the snow was waist-deep in some spots, and the chore of keeping the ranch running took up every daylight hour. Ethan and the hands rode out every day to check on the herd, break the ice on the water troughs, and haul feed to the cattle that could not get to the frozen grass. Clara took care of the house, the supplies, and the account books, the ledgers Ethan finally showed her after she backed him into a corner in the kitchen, and told him she could not run a house she did not understand. The money was tighter than she had imagined, not desperate because Ethan was too smart for that. But it was tight enough that one single bad season could throw everything off balance. "We have to sell 20 head of cattle this spring," Clara told him one evening with the ledger spread open between them, "before the drive prices fall. And we have got to work out a better deal with that buyer in Cheyenne. The one you have been using is taking 15% more than the market rate." Ethan just stared at the numbers she had circled. "How do you know what the market rate is?" "I have been reading the agricultural reports at Howell's store. He keeps them right behind the counter. I just asked to see them." Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked at her, not with surprise anymore, but with something deeper. It was a respect that had grown past admiration and turned into a genuine reliance. "I married the smartest woman in the entire territory," he said. "You married the only woman in the territory who is willing to read agricultural reports for fun," Clara replied. "Do not get the two things confused." But she was smiling, and so was he. And the numbers written on the page seemed a lot less scary when the two of them were looking at them together. February brought a whole different kind of trouble. Clara was hanging the laundry out on the line, a chore she insisted on doing herself no matter how much Ethan told her she should be resting. Then the pain hit her, a sharp and sudden ache low in her belly. She dropped the shirt she was holding and had to grab onto the fence post, bending over from the pain. Miguel saw her from the corral. He was at her side in just a few seconds. "Senora, what is it?" "Pain," Clara managed to get out. "It came on so fast." The color drained right out of Miguel's face. "How far along are you?" 6 months. It is too soon, Miguel. It is just too soon." He did not waste a single moment on false reassurances. He helped her get inside, got her settled into the bed, and then rode for town faster than Clara had ever seen a man ride a horse. Ethan was out in the north pasture when one of the hands brought him the news. He covered 6 miles in what felt like just a few minutes, bursting right through the front door without his hat, his face the color of ashes. Clara was lying on the bed with her eyes shut, her hands resting on her stomach. Mrs. Coulton was already there. Miguel had stopped by her ranch on his way to town, and she was gently pressing a cool cloth on Clara's forehead. "Is she—" Ethan could not even finish the question. "The pain has stopped," Mrs. Coulton said with a firm voice. "The baby is moving. That is a good sign, but she has got to rest completely. No more chores, no lifting, and no standing for more than a couple of minutes at a time." "For how long?" Clara asked, her voice sounding weak. "Until that baby is ready to enter this world on its own time, not on yours." Clara looked over at Ethan. His face was a complete mess. Every single emotion he had spent his whole life learning to keep under control was crashing across his features like waves hitting a rock wall. Fear, helplessness, and a desperate kind of love that had nowhere to go and nothing it could fix. She reached out her hand for his. He took it and fell to his knees right there beside the bed. "I am all right," she said. "We are all right." "You scared me," he said, his voice all raw. "Clara, you scared me half to death." "I scared myself," she said, squeezing his hand. "But I am not going anywhere, and neither is this baby. We Calloway women are a stubborn bunch, remember?" He pressed his face into her hand and just breathed. He simply breathed. And Clara held him right there and felt the fear slowly seep out of his body, replaced by a new kind of determination she could feel in the tightening of his grip. From that day on, Ethan ran the house as well as the ranch. His cooking was terrible at first, until Miguel finally took pity on him and taught him the basics. He cleaned, he did the laundry that Clara had been hanging up when the pain had hit her. And he did it all with the stubborn resolve of a man who would gladly wash every shirt in Wyoming if it meant keeping his wife and child safe. Clara ran things from the bed, and then later from a rocking chair Ethan had specially ordered from the carpenter in town. It showed up on a Tuesday afternoon. It was beautifully made, sanded down until it was smooth as glass, with arms wide enough to rest a book on. Ethan carried it inside and set it down right by the fireplace. Clara slowly lowered herself into it and felt a tightness in her chest just let go. "For when the baby gets here," Ethan said, his hand running along the polished wood. "And for now." Clara rocked back and forth gently, just testing it out. "It is perfect. When did you order this?" "The day after the wedding. I wanted you to have something that was all your own." Clara looked up at him and her eyes started to well up. She had only cried one single time since she had arrived in Silver Bluff, the night she learned about Sarah Lindsay. She had made a promise to herself that she would not cry again. But this was different. This was not sadness or fear or anger. This was the overwhelming feeling of being loved by a man who showed it with rocking chairs and quiet sacrifices, and with calloused hands that could gentle a horse and hold a woman with the very same care. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "You are welcome." Spring arrived the way it always did in Wyoming. It came on slowly at first, and then all at once. The snow pulled back, the grass turned green, the garden dirt finally thawed out, and Miguel was out in it before the last of the frost was even gone. He was turning the soil and planting seeds with the careful focus of a man keeping a promise he made to his mother a long, long time ago. Clara watched him from the porch. Her belly was big and round now, with the baby due to arrive any week. She had gotten her strength back over those long, frustrating months of having to rest, and she was getting restless enough to climb the walls. She wanted to be down in that garden. She wanted to be back in her kitchen. She wanted to do anything at all besides sit in a rocking chair and just wait. "Patience," Miguel would tell her every morning as he walked past the porch on his way to the garden. "Easy for you to say," Clara would answer back every single morning. "Not easy at all," he would reply every morning. "I spent 8 years waiting for this ranch to finally feel like a home. Patience is about the hardest work a person can do." On a Tuesday in late May, exactly 1 year and 3 weeks after Clara had gotten off a train in Silver Bluff to find a crumpled letter instead of a husband, her daughter decided it was time to make her appearance. The labor was a long one, 14 hours. Mrs. Colton was there to help, steady and knowing what to do, while Ethan paced back and forth on the porch until he nearly wore a groove in the wood. Miguel sat on the bunkhouse steps and whittled. "Waitin' on you." Outside, Ethan sat on the porch steps, whittling on that same piece of mesquite he'd been nursing for months. Clara figured it was a little hoarse, but Ethan, he was a quiet man and refused to say. Inside the house, Clara held onto the bedpost so tight her knuckles were white. She just tried to breathe through the hurt as it rolled over her, each wave bigger and meaner than the one before. Mrs. Colton was right there talking her through it, steady as a rock, no fuss, just calm, sensible words. "You're doing just fine, Clara, honey. You're a strong woman. This little one knows it's got a strong mama. This baby has got awful timing," Clara managed to gasp out. "Just like her daddy." Mrs. Colulton let out a soft chuckle. Oh, all babies got terrible timing. It's the first way they show you they've got a mind of their own. Just as the sun started to paint the sky, Clara gave one last push with every ounce of strength she had. And then she heard it. A high, sharp, angry little cry. That was the sound, all right. The sound of a brand new soul letting the world know it had arrived, whether the world was ready or not. "It's a girl," Mrs. Colulton said, and Clara could hear the smile in her voice even before the woman laid that little bundle in her arms. A healthy, pretty, and powerful-lunged baby girl. Clara looked down at her daughter. She had that sandy blonde hair, just like Ethan's, and a little chin that looked just as stubborn as her own. Her tiny hands were balled up into fists, ready to fight the air, and her mouth was wide open, letting everyone know she wasn't too pleased about this whole business of being born. "Well, hello there," Clara whispered. "I've been waiting on you." Just then the bedroom door creaked open. Ethan was just standing there in the doorway, and the look on his face was something Clara knew she would remember for every last one of her days. He had the look of a man who'd just walked through a door and found his whole world, everything he'd ever hoped for, waiting right there for him. He was stunned, thankful, and just cracked wide open with pure joy. "Come on in and meet your daughter," Clara said softly. He walked across that room like his legs weren't quite sure they belonged to him. He sat down on the side of the bed and just stared at the baby in Clara's arms. And then his hand, a hand that could wrestle a horseshoe into place, swing a heavy axe all day, or hold a rifle steady in a blue norther, reached out. He touched his daughter's cheek so gently, it made Mrs. Colulton have to turn away and dab at her eyes. "She's just perfect," Ethan whispered. "She's got your stubborn streak," Clara murmured back. "I can tell already. Lord help us both." They decided to name her Rose Elizabeth Calloway. Rose was for Ethan's mama, and Elizabeth was for Clara's grandmother. About an hour later, Miguel showed up at the bedroom door. In his worn, wrinkled hand, he held that little carved horse. He set it gently on the table next to the bed. "This is for her, for when she's big enough," he said, his voice all gravelly. "My own mother used to make one for every new baby back in our village." Clara reached over and took his hand in hers. "Well, it looks like she's got herself an uncle now, whether he likes it or not." "Believe it." Miguel's jaw was tight. He gave a single nod, squeezed her hand, and then he was out the door before he let his composure crumble any more. The months that came after were the richest of Clara's entire life. Rose grew just like everything else on the Redstone Ranch, with a stubborn and powerful will, all on her own time. She had Ethan's quiet way of watching things and Clara's own fierce spirit. By 6 months old, she was scooting across the kitchen floor so fast it scared everybody half to death, but absolutely thrilled Miguel. He went and built a small wooden gate for the doorway and made himself her unofficial protector. The ranch was thriving. Ethan's steady hand and Clara's sharp mind for figures got them through the year with plenty to spare. The herd got bigger, the garden grew more than they could eat, and the house was filled with the sounds and smells of a good life. Fresh bread baking, Rose's laughter, and the sound of Ethan's boots on the porch at day's end. Miguel singing old Spanish songs to the baby when he figured nobody could hear him. Franklin Hargrove tried to get his hands on their water rights one last time that spring. He drove out to the Redstone with a brand new contract and another offer, sitting right there at their kitchen table with his slick banker's smile and his carefully prepared numbers. Clara sat right across from him with a ledger book open on the table, and Rose settled on her hip. She took his proposal apart piece by piece, pointing out the puffed-up values, the tricky clauses hidden in the fine print, and a penalty system that would have handed Hargrove the creek inside of 3 years. "Mr. Hargrove," she said when she was done, "this contract is built to do one thing, steal our water and make us say thank you for it. So my answer is no. My husband's answer is no. And if you ever bring another piece of paper like this to our home, I will print every last word of it in the Silver Bluff Gazette so every rancher in this valley can see just how you operate." Hargrove just stared at her. Then his eyes flickered over to Ethan, who was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, not even trying to hide his smile. "Your wife, she drives a hard bargain, Calloway." "My wife just sees things plain," Ethan answered back. "That is not the same thing." Hargrove left. He never came back. On Rose's first birthday, the Redstone was overflowing with people. Ranchers and their families, the Coltons with all their kids, Mrs. Pennington carrying a cake she baked herself, and Howell from the general store with a picture book he had ordered all the way from Denver. The yard was alive with laughter and talk, and Clara stood on the porch, just watching it all with the quiet amazement of a woman who had once stood on a dusty depot platform with $12 in a crumpled letter, completely certain her life was finished. Ethan found her there just as the sun was starting to dip low. He slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her in close. She leaned against him the way she always did, with all her weight, trusting that he would hold her up. "I was just thinking about that day at the depot," she said in a low voice. "How close I was to getting on that train heading east." "I would have come after you," Ethan said. The certainty in his voice was as solid as the ground they stood on. He was not bragging or putting on a show, just stating a simple fact. "Maybe not that very day, but I would have. Once I met you, I do not think I could have ever let you go." Clara turned around to face him. "You never told me that before?" "Did not want you thinking I had taken advantage of the situation." Ethan Calloway. She shook her head with the kind of loving frustration a woman has when she has explored every part of a man's heart and still keeps finding new rooms. "After all this time, do you really not know that I fell for you just as fast? By the time you asked me to marry you at Founder's Day, I was already praying you would." His smile appeared slowly, the way it always did, starting in his eyes long before it ever touched his mouth. "I was hoping, but you're not always the easiest woman to read, Mrs. Calloway." "Then let me make it plain for you." She stood up on her toes and kissed him. "I love you. I'm thankful for every single day, and I have never, not for 1 second, regretted saying yes." From inside the house, Rose's laugh rang out over the conversation like a little bell. Then came Miguel's voice, singing something in Spanish, a soft, old song full of a happiness it had taken him a lifetime to find. Ethan held Clara tight against his chest, and she could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart, as faithful as the land itself. "You know what Guthrie told me last week?" Ethan whispered. "What?" "He said he's been working that depot for 30 years, and he has seen dozens of mail-order brides pass through Silver Bluff. Most of them went right where they were supposed to go. A few turned back, but he said he had never seen one get left on the platform and wind up happier than all the others put together." Clara smiled. "What did you tell him?" "I told him she was not abandoned. She was just delivered to the wrong address, and the right one found her before she could get away." Clara pressed her face into his shirt and breathed him in. The smell of dust and soap and leather and home. Behind them, the house was warm and full of life. The land rolled out in all directions, huge and demanding, but generous all the same. Their daughter was laughing. Their friends were all gathered around, and the train depot where Clara Whitfield had once stood all alone with a crumpled letter in her hand was 6 miles to the south and a whole lifetime behind her. She had come out west, just trying to survive. But what she found was something so much bigger. It was a love story that started with rejection and was built up one board at a time, one meal at a time, one season at a time, into a home that nothing and nobody could ever break. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.